Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Arthur placed 3 plates on the dining table. Not 2, not 1, 3. It had been years since his children last sat there together, yet the habit remained untouched, as if time itself had refused to move forward inside this house. His hands followed the same pattern every day, slow but certain, arranging each plate with quiet care. The house, once filled with constant noise, had grown into something else entirely. Silence had settled into the walls, deep and permanent. Even the faint sound of the clock ticking felt louder than it should, stretching each second into something heavier. Arthur lived alone now. At 75, he moved slower, spoke less, and listened more, to memories mostly. His children were alive, successful, and busy with lives he had spent decades helping them build. He was proud of that, truly proud. But pride did not fill empty rooms. They called sometimes, not often, but enough to keep the connection from completely disappearing. Short calls, polite voices, careful words. "We'll visit soon. Work has been hectic. Take care, Dad." Arthur always replied the same way. "Don't worry about me." And every time he said it, he meant it, and didn't mean it at all. That evening, as the fading sunlight slipped quietly through the window, he sat down at the table and looked at the empty chairs. His eyes rested there for longer than usual. Then slowly he reached for one of the plates. His hand paused midair. For a moment, it felt like something inside him was asking a question he had avoided for years. But instead of answering it, he gently placed the plate back exactly where it was. Mornings were different. They carried a softness that evenings lacked. Arthur would wake up early, before the world fully settled into motion, and make himself a cup of tea. He preferred sitting near the window, where the light slowly filled the room and made everything feel less empty. For those brief moments, life almost felt familiar again, like nothing had really changed, like the silence was only temporary. But as the hours passed, that illusion faded. The house returned to its usual stillness, stretching across every room, waiting without expectation. Arthur moved through it quietly, his footsteps slower now, measured in a way they never used to be. That morning, he found himself staring at his phone for longer than usual. It rested on the table, unmoving, silent. He picked it up, his fingers lightly brushing against the screen as he scrolled through contacts he rarely called anymore. His eyes stopped at his youngest son's name. For a moment, his thumb hovered just above the call button. "He must be working," Arthur whispered softly. It was the same reason he always gave, a reason that had slowly become a habit, just like the plates on the table. He placed the phone back down carefully, as if even that small decision carried weight. Later, he stepped outside for a short walk. The street looked the same as always, yet somehow felt different. People passed by without noticing him, their lives moving quickly, filled with purpose. Arthur walked a little slower than usual, not because he was tired, but because he didn't feel in a hurry to return to the silence waiting for him at home. By the time Arthur returned home, the sky had already begun to dim. The soft light of evening slipped through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, he stood at the doorway, his hand still resting on the handle, as if he had forgotten why he had come back at all. Inside, nothing had changed. The same quiet rooms, the same still air, the same feeling waiting for him like it always did. He stepped in slowly and closed the door behind him. The sound echoed faintly. Arthur walked toward the dining table, his eyes instinctively moving toward the chairs that once held so much life. He could almost hear it if he stood there long enough. Voices overlapping, laughter breaking through, someone calling his name from another room. But memory had a way of fading just before it felt real. As usual, he reached for the cabinet and took out the plates. One by one, he placed them on the table. His movements movements were careful, almost ritual-like, as though he were performing something that could not be skipped. 3 plates, 3 places, 3 absences. He stood there for a moment staring at them. Then, without fully understanding why, he pulled out a chair and sat down before finishing the rest. It was something he had never done before. Usually, everything had to be perfect first, but today felt different. He looked at the empty seats around him, his expression calm yet distant. "It used to be loud here," he said softly, though no one was there to hear it. His voice felt unfamiliar, as if it no longer belonged to the house. For the first time in years, Arthur didn't rush to complete the table. He simply sat there, listening to nothing. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the hours moved slowly past him. The silence felt heavier than usual, pressing against his thoughts in a way he couldn't ignore. Eventually, he sat up and reached for the lamp beside his bed. The soft light filled the room, revealing familiar surroundings that suddenly felt distant. He stood up carefully and walked toward the living room. Something had drawn him there. Perhaps it was restlessness, or perhaps it was something deeper. He wasn't sure. Near the corner of the room sat an old wooden cabinet he hadn't opened in years. Inside, he knew, were things he had chosen not to revisit, memories frozen in time, untouched for reasons he never fully explained to himself. Arthur hesitated for a moment before opening it. The faint scent of old paper filled the air. He reached inside and pulled out a small box, placing it gently on the table. His hands moved slower now, more careful, as though even the act of remembering required effort. Inside the box were photographs, dozens of them, moments captured from a life that once felt full. Arthur picked one up. It showed all 3 of his children standing beside him, smiling widely, their faces bright with a happiness that felt almost impossible to recreate. He studied the picture quietly, his eyes tracing every detail. "You were all here," he whispered. The room remained silent, but something inside him shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to make him realize how much had changed without him noticing when it happened. The photograph remained in Arthur's hands longer than he realized. Time seemed to slow as he stared at it, his eyes moving from one familiar face to another. There was something unsettling about seeing happiness preserved so clearly, when the present felt so distant from it. He leaned back slightly, letting out a quiet breath he hadn't noticed he was holding. The room around him stayed still, unchanged, yet it no longer felt the same. Carefully, he placed the photograph back into the box, but instead of closing it, he reached for another, then another. Each image carried a piece of something he had slowly lost without noticing when it began to fade. Birthdays, holidays, simple afternoons that once felt ordinary, now carrying a weight they never had before. Arthur paused at one particular picture. It showed him sitting at the same dining table, surrounded by his children. They were younger then, closer, leaning toward him without distance or hesitation. For a brief moment it almost felt real again, but only for a moment. He set the photo aside and closed the box gently, his hands resting on top of it. "We had time," he said quietly. It wasn't regret exactly, it was something deeper, a realization that time had never actually been missing. It had simply been taken for granted. The next evening, Arthur did something different. At 6 o'clock, he walked to the table as he always did, but his movements lacked their usual certainty. He stood there for a moment, looking at the empty space in front of him, as if trying to remember what came next. Slowly, he opened the cabinet and took out a single plate. Just one. He placed it on the table and stepped back. The absence of the others felt louder than their presence ever had. Arthur sat down carefully, his hands resting near the untouched cup of tea. He stared at it for a while before finally picking it up, taking a slow sip. The room remained quiet, but But this time the silence felt different. It no longer carried expectation. It carried acceptance. After a few minutes, he reached for his phone. There was no hesitation this time. He dialed his eldest son's number and waited. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then it connected. "Dad." Arthur's expression softened slightly. "Hello," he said gently. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the faint sound of movement, as if the call had been answered in the middle of something else. "Is everything okay?" his son asked. Arthur looked around the quiet room before answering. "Yes," he said. Then, after a brief moment, he added, "I just wanted to hear your voice." The call didn't last long. It ended the same way most of their conversations did, quickly, politely, without anything truly said. "I'll call you later," his son had said. Arthur nodded, even though the gesture couldn't be seen. "Of course," he replied. When the line went silent, he kept the phone in his hand for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then slowly, he placed it back on the table. The room returned to its quiet state, unchanged, unaffected. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the empty space across from him. There was no expectation left now, no quiet hope that someone might walk through the door, just stillness. Later that night, as he prepared to go to bed, a sudden tightness spread across his chest. He paused, his hand pressing lightly against it, his breath slowing as if trying to control something invisible. "It will pass," he whispered. He had said the same thing before, but this time felt different. He moved carefully toward the chair, sitting down as the feeling grew heavier. His eyes shifted toward the table where his phone rested, just within reach. For a brief moment he considered it, calling someone, anyone, but the thought passed as quietly as it had come. Instead, he closed his eyes, letting the silence settle around him one last time. The next morning, the house remained still. Sunlight slowly entered through the window, touching the same furniture, the same walls, the same quiet spaces that had grown used to waiting. But this time, nothing moved within them. Hours later, a neighbor passing by noticed the door slightly open. It was unusual. Arthur was always careful with small things like that. They knocked once, then again. Receiving no response, they stepped inside cautiously. The house felt different, not just quiet, but empty in a way that couldn't be explained. Arthur was found sitting in his chair, his posture calm, his expression peaceful, as if he had simply paused and never continued. The news reached his children later that day. Calls were made, plans were canceled, flights were booked. Everything that once seemed urgent suddenly felt meaningless. When they arrived, the house stood exactly as it had always been. Nothing had changed, except everything. They walked through the room slowly, noticing details they hadn't paid attention to in years. The photographs, the furniture, the silence. Then they saw the table. One plate, one cup, no waiting left. One of them picked up the cup, holding it carefully, as if it might still carry something fragile. "When was the last time we came here?" someone asked softly. No one answered, because they all knew. They had time, they just chose not to use it. Now, time was the one thing they no longer had.